Thomas Brennan arrived at the Silverdale Ranch as nobody. He was 22 years old with calloused hands, minimal education, and no family connections that mattered. The ranch foreman hired him without much consideration. He was strong enough to do the work, desperate enough to accept meager wages, and unremarkable enough that he wouldn't cause trouble. For the first 5 years, Thomas was exactly what people expected him to be, a competent but forgettable ranch hand who showed up every day, did his job without complaint, and lived in the small bunkhouse that smelled of dust and other men's sweat. He watched the more ambitious cowboys move on to bigger opportunities. He watched ranch owners' sons inherit authority they hadn't earned. He accepted that his entire life would probably be defined by following orders and collecting wages that barely kept him alive. Then everything changed. The day the rustlers came, it started like any other morning until Thomas noticed cattle missing from the north pasture. His immediate response was to report the theft to the foreman, a man named Garrett who'd overseen ranch operations for 20 years. Garrett's response was predictable: send word to the ranch owner and wait for instructions. The rustlers would be long gone before any official response could be mounted. But Thomas couldn't accept that. He'd spent 5 years watching helplessly as injustice moved through this territory unchecked. He'd seen rustlers steal from small ranches, watch them disappear into the desert knowing they'd face no consequences. He understood something fundamental, that waiting for official channels to work meant accepting ongoing theft and loss. Have you ever reached a moment where following orders felt like betrayal? Where accepting the system suddenly seemed like complicity? Have you ever realized that the difference between being ordinary and becoming extraordinary is simply deciding to act when everyone else accepts failure? That's what happened to Thomas that morning. He made a choice that would define the rest of his life. By the time this story concludes, you'll understand that legends aren't born. They're created through a series of decisions where someone chooses to do what's right even when it's dangerous, even when it's easier to accept defeat. Thomas tracked the rustlers alone. He followed the stolen cattle through terrain that most people wouldn't dare enter, following hoofprints and broken brush, reading the landscape the way other men read books. He traveled for 2 days without sleeping, sustained by determination and the clear understanding that he was doing something nobody had asked him to do, something that could get him killed, something that might define his entire existence. He found the rustlers camped in a hidden canyon, preparing to drive the stolen cattle across territorial lines where they could be sold without questions. There were 5 of them, professional criminals who'd operated without consequence across 3 territories for years. Thomas should have been terrified. He was vastly outnumbered. He had no official authority. He was a ranch hand without backup or resources. But he approached their camp with absolute certainty, his hand resting on his gun, his voice carrying authority born from the conviction that what he was doing was right. "I'm here for the cattle," Thomas said simply. "You're going to drive them back, or this becomes something that ends with bloodshed." The rustlers actually laughed. They'd faced down sheriffs and survived. A single young cowboy didn't concern them. Their leader, a scarred man named Holt, stood up and reached for his weapon. What happened next would be told as stories across the frontier for decades. Thomas moved with a speed and precision that suggested years of practice rather than the ranch handwork his background suggested. His gun cleared leather, and in seconds, 3 of the 5 rustlers were on the ground, wounded and disarmed. The remaining 2 surrendered immediately, understanding that they'd encountered someone operating on a completely different level than their expectations. Thomas drove the recovered cattle back to the ranch alone, arriving at dawn. When the ranch owner saw him, when he understood what Thomas had accomplished, everything changed. The ranch hand nobody noticed suddenly became somebody impossible to ignore. Word spread. Stories about the young cowboy who'd tracked rustlers alone, confronted them without backup, and recovered stolen cattle through sheer skill and determination. Other ranches heard the stories. Territorial authorities heard the stories. Within months, Thomas had offers to work as hired law enforcement, to lead cattle drives, to manage operations. Thomas accepted a position as a range detective, an unofficial but crucial role protecting ranches across the territory from rustlers and criminals who operated outside official law. He became legendary for his ability to track animals and criminals, for his refusal to accept defeat, for his willingness to ride into dangerous situations alone if necessary. But Thomas's legend wasn't just built on violence or capability. It was built on integrity. He never took a life unless absolutely necessary. He arrested criminals and delivered them to authorities rather than administering frontier justice personally. He helped small ranchers who couldn't afford his services. He refused to work for men he believed were engaged in criminal activity themselves. Thomas became a bridge between official law enforcement and frontier survival. He worked with sheriffs and territorial marshals, providing information and assistance they couldn't generate themselves. He respected the system even when it was inadequate, working within it while also acknowledging its limitations. By the time Thomas was 40, he was the most respected figure in the territory. Young cowboys wanted to work for him. Ranchers sought his advice on security. Criminals fled the region simply knowing he was present. But Thomas never let the legend diminish his character. He remained humble, continued to work physically alongside his employees, and never forgot that he'd started as a nobody that nobody noticed. He married a woman named Catherine, the daughter of a prominent ranching family who'd been told she should pursue someone with better prospects. Catherine saw in Thomas something that transcended his background. She saw integrity, capability, and a quiet determination that mattered far more than family connections or inherited wealth. Together, they established a school to teach young people the skills they needed to survive on the frontier. Not just riding and shooting, but reading, writing, and the ability to think strategically about problems. Thomas believed that frontier survival shouldn't be limited to those born into opportunity. The legend of Thomas Brennan became something larger than one man. It became a story about how ordinary people could become extraordinary through determination and integrity. It became a reminder that beginning as nobody didn't mean ending as nothing. It became a representation of the possibility that existed on the frontier, that you could build a meaningful life based on your abilities and character rather than your background. Years later, when Thomas was elderly and speaking to young people about his life, he always emphasized the same point. I wasn't special. I was just willing to act when others accepted defeat. I was willing to take risks when others chose safety. I was willing to be wrong if it meant doing what I believed was right. That's not genius. That's simply choice. The choice to be more than what circumstances suggest you should be. If you're watching this, convinced that your background determines your future, that you're too ordinary to become extraordinary, hear this. Thomas Brennan started as a ranch hand nobody noticed. He became legendary because he chose to act when it would have been easier to accept the system's failures. He proved that character and determination matter more than background or connections. If this story moved you, please like and share it with someone who believes their humble beginning is their permanent ceiling. Someone who's convinced themselves that they'll always be ordinary. Because somewhere, someone with nothing is deciding whether to accept their circumstances or act on their convictions. Your reminder that ordinary people create legends through their choices might be exactly what gives them courage to become more than they thought possible. Be the person who refuses to accept defeat. Be the nobody who becomes somebody. That's how legends are actually built.